winter that broke the Von Dorn line arrived without ceremony, the way true disasters do. Central Germany in the early 14th century carried no romance in its cold. It was a hard land of timber walls and soot-dark rafters of thin bread, salted meat, and prayers spoken more out of habit than hope. The Thanian forest pressed against the village like a living border, its trees standing close enough that the wind inside them sounded different than the wind in the fields. Christian bells marked the hours, but older markers still held their place in the minds of people who worked the soil. A stone half buried at the edge of a path, a hollow where mushrooms never grew, a circle of standing rocks that the children were taught to avoid without being told why. The Von Dorn family were not yet noble in any meaningful sense. They were farmers with name attached to a strip of land and a few animals that had survived earlier winters. Their life had the blunt logic of survival. Sow when the earth allowed it, harvest before the rain turned mean, keep the roof from collapsing, keep the children breathing. The village knew their faces the way a village knows all faces, by familiarity rather than affection. They attended mass, paid what was demanded, and kept their disputes quiet. The only thing remarkable about them was the boy, Dietrich, because youth itself becomes remarkable in a time when illness can take it without warning. The storm that swallowed him came late in the season, when everyone thought the worst had already passed. Snow fell in thick sheets, blurring the fences into white lines and turning the world into a single color. Dietrich went out before dusk to bring in a goat that strayed toward the trees. This was ordinary. People stepped into weather all the time, believing that if they moved quickly enough, the cold would not notice them. He did not return. Search parties formed by habit more than optimism. Men with torches walked the margins of the forest and called his name until their voices sounded like strangers in their own mouths. They found torn branches low to the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged through them. They found odd indentations in the snow that did not resemble footprints, too long and too shallow, arranged in a pattern that resisted interpretation. The priest, Father Albrecht, recorded the disappearance in the parish register with the dry language of the era. Missing in storm, presumed dead, prayers offered. There was no space in ink for fear. Fear was carried in the body, in the tightness of the shoulders when the forest line came into view. 15 days passed. The village did what it always did with absence. It made room for it. A mass was held for the boy's soul. The family wept in public, the mother's face becoming a fixed mask that suggested she had cried herself into exhaustion long before anyone saw her. Neighbors brought bread and spoke carefully, avoiding any mention of the tracks, the branches, the way the forest had seemed to listen. On the 16th night, Dietrich returned. No one recorded the exact moment he stepped into the lamplight, but multiple testimonies agree on the shape of it. He appeared at the edge of the field, coming from the direction of the trees, barefoot on ice that should have torn skin. His clothes hung in strips. His hair was stiff with frost, yet the snow around him was unbroken, as if he'd been placed there rather than walking to that spot. The most unsettling detail was the stillness of his body. Survivors described it as the stillness of someone who had learned to conserve motion, not from hardship, but from instruction. The boy who returned did not behave like a boy who had been lost and found. He did not collapse into his mother's arms. He did not babble explanations. He stood and looked at the faces around him with a focus that made people step back without realizing they were doing it. His eyes were open and alert, but not warm. He stared through people as if they were cloth hanging between him and something else. For days he spoke very little. He moved through the house touching familiar objects as if confirming their texture. A wooden bowl, a spindle, the iron hook by the hearth. At night, villagers began to see him walking toward the forest line, always alone, always at the same hour, the way a person goes to meet something that expects punctuality. He would stop at the place the village avoided, the circle of stones half buried in roots. Some claimed he stood there for hours without shifting his weight. Others said they saw him kneel. No one went close enough to be certain. Certainty, in those years, was a luxury. When he finally spoke in a way that Father Albrecht considered recordable, his words were spare. The priest's handwriting, preserved in a later copy, shows hesitation where the quill pressed too long. Dietrich had been asked, gently at first, and then with growing urgency where he had been. He answered in a single sentence that made the priest's notes turn colder. I did not die. Something refused me. The church in that region had authority, but it also had boundaries. It could name sins, bless fields, punish heresies. It could not comfortably name what happened in forests that had belonged to other beliefs before Rome's cross had reached them. Father Albrecht attempted to anchor the event in language he understood. Trauma, fevered dreams, the delirium of near death. Yet the village watched the changes that followed and found no comfort in those explanations. Animals reacted first. Dogs that had once followed Dietrich now kept their distance, tails low, whining as if reprimanded by an invisible hand. A horse refused to stand in the stall if the boy walked past it. A cow kicked at empty air when he entered the barn. People noticed candles guttering when he crossed the threshold, the flame bending away as though a draft followed him that no one else could feel. The cold in rooms deepened by degrees, not enough to frost breath, but enough to make hands flex and rub together. Then came the predictions. At first they were small, almost insulting in their simplicity. He told his father a plank would snap if he tried to carry too much firewood at once. It snapped. He told a neighbor her best hen would be dead by morning. He told a woman to bring her child inside before the wind shifted. The wind shifted, and a loose shudder struck the place where the child had been standing. These were the sorts of coincidences that could be dismissed in isolation. But the pattern did not allow isolation. The predictions grew larger, reaching beyond the farm. A barn collapsed 2 days after he spoke of rot in its beams. A distant monastery caught fire in a week. He said its walls were already burning. A man who had argued loudly in the tavern fell sick the next morning after Dietrich's eyes had rested on him too long. The village response moved in stages, as human response always does when confronted by something it cannot own. First curiosity, then fear disguised as debate, then a silence that filled every room. Some insisted the boy had been blessed, that the forest had returned to it knowledge as compensation for what it had taken. Others called him possessed, not with dramatic certainty, but with the practical dread of people who believed possession was not a story, but an event that could reach across a room. Mothers began to keep their children close. Men began to avoid speaking the boy's name at night. Father Albrecht faced pressure from both sides. There were those who demanded he confront the matter as a priest, to interrogate the boy and, if necessary, drive out what had entered him. There were others who warned him to leave it alone, because what came from the forest did not answer to holy water. The priest chose a third path, the one clergy often choose when cornered by uncertainty: documentation. He wrote, he observed, he avoided pronouncing judgment. The family, sensing danger and opportunity, made a decision that would outlive everyone present. They protected Dietrich. They refused to send him away. They did not bind him. They did not deliver him to the bishop for examination. They kept him in the house, under their roof, as if possession could be managed the way livestock could be managed, by fences and routine. This protection, offered out of love or fear or calculation, marked the beginning of their ascent. It is here that the archives turned strange. Within a handful of seasons, land that had been contested for years began to shift toward the Von Dorn holdings with no clear explanation. A small debt disappeared from a ledger as if erased, replaced by a note that bore no signature. A local landowner, previously hostile, gifted a strip of orchard to the family after meeting Dietrich. The bishop himself traveled to the village, a rare act for the era, and requested counsel from a farmer's son. Witnesses say Dietrich would not enter the church to meet him. He remained outside, fingers resting on the stone wall as if listening to it, and spoke only one sentence before turning away. This place is blind. Father Albrecht attempted the interrogation when the bishop's presence made avoidance impossible. The priest's notes survive only in fragments, copied later by a clerk who seems to have been shaken by what he read. The account does not describe dramatic contortions or screaming. It describes a room growing steadily colder. It describes a sensation of being watched from a direction no one could name. It describes Dietrich sitting with his hands folded, eyes open, calm as stone. The priest wrote, in a line that stains the page, that the boy did not answer questions so much as endure them. 3 days after that night, Father Albrecht fell ill with fever that arrived without warning. His skin burned. His speech deteriorated into murmurs. His last recorded words, reported by an altar boy who lived long enough to repeat them, were not a prayer. They were an observation, whispered with a certainty that left no room for comfort. His eyes were not human. After the priest's death, the village ceased attempting to name the phenomenon. It shifted into avoidance. Windows stayed shuttered at night. People crossed themselves when they passed the Von Dorn house. Those who had been bold enough to mock the family stopped being bold. Illness visited them. Accidents found them. A man who had threatened to burn the house discovered his barn struck by lightning on a clear evening. The smell of char drifting through air that should have been clean. Dietrich died at 28. No one claims to know why he went into the forest that night, only that he did, and that the village did not follow. He was found near the stone circle at dawn, lying on frozen ground with his hands crossed over his chest as if arranged for burial. His eyes were open. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle. Yet the snow around him had been burned into a perfect ring, blackened as if by heat intense enough to scour life from soil. Nothing grew there afterward. Not moss, not grass, not weeds. The circle remained, a scar in white winters and green summers alike. This was not the end. It was the establishment of a rule. Every generation that followed produced one marked descendant. The description repeats with unsettling consistency across private letters and parish marginalia. The distant gaze, the aversion to churches, the way candles behave in their presence, the knowledge that arrived before events. These heirs rarely died in beds. They were found near forests, caves, old stones. They died young. The family learned to hide them, then protect them, then to fear them without admitting fear. Nobility came to the Von Dorn Name in the way mold comes to bread, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. They gained land. They gained influence. They also gained a silence around them that thickened with each generation. The last heir died in the 18th century without children. The estate was abandoned, not sold, not inherited. It simply emptied. The forest took the roofs first, then the walls, then the memory. The stone circle remained because stones outlast human story. Local children, centuries later, would still dare each other to step inside it and discover that the air there felt wrong, thinner, colder, as if the world had been scraped clean. In winter, villagers claimed to see footprints leading from a village toward the circle, single file, unhurried, ending at the burned ring. No prince ever led away. There is a temptation, when faced with such accounts, to treat them as folklore that grew in the dark. But what endures in this record is not a monster described in detail. It is a pattern preserved by ink and habit. Disappearance, return, ascent, repetition, erasure. The forest did not simply take a boy and give him back. It left a mark on the bloodline, and the bloodline carried that mark as if carrying a sealed letter it could not read, but could never set down. And when the Von Dorn estate finally fell silent, when the last marked heir went into the trees and did not return, the question that remained was not what he saw in the stone circle. The question was what demanded to be written elsewhere, in another land, in another ink, because the next door opens far to the south, where power did not come through prophecy or forest heat, but through a name pressed onto parchment, one that behaved like hunger given language. Ink behaves differently at altitude. In the Basque valleys of the late 15th century, scribes learned this early. The air was thinner, the cold sharper, and parchment responded to pressure with an unforgiving honesty. A trembling hand showed. A hesitant stroke left a scar. Words written in those valleys carried weight not because of poetry or faith, but because they were binding. An oath spoken could be denied. An oath written endured. This belief sat deeper than the church, deeper even than the old mountain spirits whose names were no longer spoken aloud. To write was to make something real. The Lanserre family built its quiet authority on this principle. They were not lords of land or men of arms. They were custodians of names. Contracts passed through their hands. Disputes ended at their table. Their records were considered final not because they were sanctioned by a crown, but because generations had learned that a Lanserre ledger did not lie. Their house stood at the edge of the Arzila Valley, stone walls thick enough to keep out wind and most questions. Inside, shelves bowed under the weight of parchment, each sheet carrying a life-altering decision rendered permanent by ink. By 1487, Etienne Lanserre had inherited both the family desk and its reputation. Contemporary accounts describe him as precise to the point of discomfort. His handwriting was studied by apprentices the way monks studied scripture. Even under stress, his letters did not waver. This detail matters, because what followed was first noticed not in what he wrote, but in how his hand behaved when the night came. The storm arrived after midnight, sudden and violent. Thunder rolled to the valley with a force that rattled shutters and drove animals into corners. Etienne was awake, working by candlelight, correcting a land agreement that would determine boundaries for decades to come. His wife, Isabel, later testified that the knock on the door did not sound like a knock. It sounded like pressure being applied from the other side, steady and patient. When Etienne opened the door, the storm did not enter. The wind fell silent around the threshold, as if the house had been sealed inside a pocket of stillness. No official record names a visitor. Later retellings argue over whether the figure wore a cloak, whether it cast a shadow, whether its voice came from its mouth or from the room itself. What survives consistently is this. The visitor placed a single sheet of parchment on the desk and told Etienne to write a name. Not a story, not a contract, a name. The Lanserre family maintained for generations that Etienne refused. This insistence appears again and again in their private letters, as if repetition could alter the past. He argued, he prayed, he attempted to push the parchment away. The visitor remained unmoved. According to Isabel's account, the voice did not threaten. It offered a statement that collapsed resistance rather than confronting it. If you do not write it, someone else will. That sentence carries a particular cruelty. It reframes refusal as delay, conscience as inconvenience. Etienne's hand shook for the first time in his life. Witnesses later said the ink in the well darkened as it stirred. He dipped the quill and wrote the name. No chronicle preserves the name itself, not because it was erased, but because no one after Etienne could reproduce it. Letters from the family describe it as wrong, not in meaning but in shape, as if the strokes did not belong to human language. The moment the quill lifted, Etienne screamed, not in fear, not in pain, in recognition. He understood what he had written in the way one understands a truth that rearranges the world. The visitor took the parchment. The door was found open afterward. The storm returned to the valley, and there were no footprints in the mud. By morning, Etienne could not speak. His tongue had turned black, swollen and stiff, as though ink itself had taken residence in his flesh. Physicians from Pamplona were summoned. They suggested poison. The priests suggested illness of the humors. None of these explanations account for the fact that Etienne attempted repeatedly to say his own name and failed each time, choking on air as if the act itself were forbidden. He died 3 days later. His tongue remained dark after burial, a detail recorded by the man who prepared his body and then refused to do so again. The valley reacted the way valleys do. It remembered. At first, the curse did not announce itself loudly. The Lanserre records continued, now kept by Etienne's son Martin. The family retained its role. Contracts were honored. Life moved forward. But within a generation, a pattern began to assert itself. Each generation produced one child who could not pronounce their own name, not out of fear, not out of stubbornness. They physically could not shape the sound. When pressed, their throats tightened. Some fainted. Some collapsed as if struck. One boy emitted a sound described in a later letter as a tearing noise, like fabric ripped too slowly. The family attempted concealment. The afflicted children were kept from public record, taught to gesture when asked their name, married late or not at all. But secrecy erodes under repetition. The valley learned to watch for signs. A child who went silent at baptism. A youth who avoided introductions. Whispers followed the Lanserre name through market and chapel alike. As decades passed, the phenomenon intensified. The silent heirs began reporting dreams of parchment floating in darkness, of hands writing without bodies, of ink spreading like veins across blank space. Some woke with stained fingers despite sleeping alone. Family letters describe waking to the sound of scratching in empty rooms. The desk drawer found open, the inkwell disturbed. The church intervened when a child collapsed during Mass after being asked to state his name. Exorcisms were attempted. They failed without drama. No screams, no convulsions, only exhaustion and afterward, silence. In 1682, a priest who insisted on breaking the curse through ritual died after coughing black fluid onto the altar. His death certificate cites fever. Marginal notes in the parish ledger suggest the writer did not believe this explanation. The ink used for those notes is thicker than the surrounding text. Press hard enough to scar the page. The Lanserre archive, preserved in fragments, reveals the cost of endurance. The marked children rarely live long. Their throats swelled, their breath shortened. Death came not as violence, but as suffocation, as if words themselves had turned hostile. One letter, written by a mother in the early 17th century, states simply that her daughter died trying to say goodbye. By the late 18th century, the family understood something the valley had intuited long before. The curse was not about punishment. It was about hunger. The name Etienne had written demanded repetition. It wanted to be spoken. Each generation provided a voice, and when the voice failed, it consumed the body instead. The last recorded descendant, Amaya Lanserre, disappeared in 1794 during the upheaval of war. Her house was found intact, food on the table, bed untouched. Only the writing desk showed disturbance. A single sheet of parchment lay upon it, marked by fresh ink in a script no scholar has deciphered. The strokes resemble no known alphabet. The page remains in a regional archive, cataloged and avoided. Conservators report that attempts to copy it produce headaches and nausea. This is recorded without interpretation. Historians dismiss the Lanserre case as folklore reinforced by coincidence. They note the isolation of the valley, the power of belief, the transmission of fear. What they do not explain is why the pattern adheres so precisely to bloodlines, or why the artifacts persist. Ink dries, parchment decays. Names once written do not always remain legible. Yet the Lanserre documents endure, and the valley still avoids a ruined house where scribes once worked, because some things do not require explanation to exert authority. The curse of the forest returned a boy altered. The curse of the valley consumed a voice. Both began with a transgression framed as necessity. Both produce a lineage marked by repetition rather than chaos. And both left behind physical evidence that refuses to settle into metaphor. As the Lanserre house fell silent, the sound that would define the next bloodline was already waiting across the sea. It was not written. It was not predicted. It was heard, carried on wind and stone, bound to land that remembers everything it has ever been given. And once heard, it could never be unheard. Ireland keeps its records in places paper cannot reach. In County Clare, where the Atlantic strikes stone with a patience that outlasts dynasties, memory settles into the land itself. Hills there do not forget footsteps. Cliffs do not release sound once it has been given to them. Long before the O'Connell name was written into parish books, the ground they lived on already carried older accounts, pressed into soil and wind and water. People learned where not to walk. They learned which hollows swallowed voices, and which paths returned them altered. These rules were not taught. They were inherited. In the middle of the 16th century, the O'Connell family occupied a narrow stretch of farmland that bordered what locals call the Old Ground. It was not forest, not field, not ruin. It was simply land that had never been claimed. No walls crossed it. No plow cut it. Sheep avoided it without instruction. The family's livelihood depended on respecting that boundary, and for generations they did, until one afternoon when a dog did not. Eogan O'Connell was not a reckless man. Records describe him as careful, quiet, dependable. He knew the limits of his land and the cost of crossing them. When his dog broke free and ran toward the Old Ground, instinct overcame rule. He followed, shouting, heart already racing with the fear of wolves, and the deeper fear of what the ground itself might answer. He vanished from sight for hours. When he returned, dusk had fallen, and the air had turned sharp. He was drenched with sweat, despite the cold. His hands shook so violently his wife had to steady him. He would not release his grip on her arm, as if letting go would allow something else to take her place. When pressed to explain where he had been, he spoke only once. "I heard her." No one asked who she was. In Ireland, that question carries weight, and weight presses back. There are many hers in the old accounts, many female voices bound to death, winter, fate, and warning. What mattered was not the identity, but the sound. That night, the O'Connell house learned what sound could do. It arrived after midnight. Not wind, not animal, not human. A scream tore through the stone walls as if they were paper. It carried force, not volume, a pressure that drove people to their knees and split glass from its frames. Cows broke their stalls and bolted into darkness. The dog collapsed where it stood, dead without wound. When the sound ended, it left silence so complete that ears rang in its absence. Aegon was found dead at dawn. There were no marks on his body, no sign of illness. His face was fixed in an expression witnesses struggled to describe. Mouth open as if answering a call that had not finished speaking. The priest recorded the death with restraint, listing no cause. The villagers did not speculate aloud. They closed doors. They avoided the old ground. They waited. From that night forward, the O'Connell curse did not hide. It announced itself with patience. Every generation produced one who heard the sound. It did not arrive fully formed. It began as a whisper carried on wind, a voice calling a name from beneath the earth. Those marked learned to recognize it early. They described it as intimate, as if it knew the shape of their thoughts. Over years, the whisper grew into a cry that followed them across fields and into sleep. On the night before their death, it became a shriek that no wall could stop. The family reacted the way families do when trapped between love and fear. They denied it. They hid it. They prayed. They blamed weakness. Clergy intervened, naming hysteria, possession, inherited illness. Physicians in later centuries spoke of nerves, of imagination sharpened by grief. None of these explanations accounted for the timing. The sound always came before death, never after. Letters survive, written by O'Connell descendants who attempted to impose order on what they experienced. One describes learning to sleep with hands pressed hard over ears, not to block the sound, but to feel the pressure of flesh as proof of still being in the world. Another recounts fleeing the county, convinced distance would dilute the curse, only to hear the whisper again in a city far from the sea. The scream followed blood, not land. The community response shifted from fear to grim familiarity. When an O'Connell child reached adolescence, neighbors watched for signs. Sleeplessness, sudden silences, a tendency to stop mid-sentence as if listening. Some families married their children away from a name, believing it might break the pattern. It did not. The sound did not respect surnames. It respected lineage. In the 18th century, one descendant, Donald O'Connell, attempted defiance. He heard the whisper at 11 and lived with it openly. He warned those around him when the cry grew louder, insisting it meant something was coming. Those he warned died within months. His father fell from a horse on a clear road. His wife drowned in a river she had crossed since childhood. His firstborn succumbed to a fever that spread nowhere else. Donald lived until 29, long enough to understand the rule. The sound did not kill him. It pulled him into its sequence. He wrote, in a letter preserved by chance, that the scream demanded witnesses as much as victims. The escalation reached its most violent expression during the famine years. Hunger stripped the land bare, and desperation drove people closer to the boundaries they once respected. In 1848, Aileen O'Connell reported seeing a figure near the cliffs at dusk. Tall, shrouded, hair hanging like riverweed. Its mouth moved without sound, as if speaking directly into the wind. Aileen believed it wanted to tell her something. She approached. That night, the scream was heard across 3 villages. Windows shattered inward. Lanterns burst. People fell to the ground, clutching their heads. At dawn, Eileen's body was found on the rocks below the cliff, intact, placed rather than broken. Her face was frozen in terror, lips parted, eyes wide, as if the scream had finally passed through her rather than around her. After that, the family fractured. Some abandoned Ireland. Some changed their names. Some refused to have children. None of it mattered. Death certificates from Scotland, America, and Canada bear the same signature. Sudden collapse. No cause listed. Witnesses reporting a cry the night before. The sound adapted to new environments without losing its shape. By the 20th century, the O'Connell line had thinned to near erasure. The last known descendant died in the 1970s. Neighbors reported a noise that could not be traced to any source, a pressure that rattled glass without wind. In her belongings, a single note was found. I finally heard what he heard. She was never screaming at us. She was screaming for us. That sentence unsettles because it reframes the entire pattern. If the sound was warning rather than punishment, then every death becomes a failure to understand rather than a sentence carried out. Ireland is rich in such misunderstandings. Warnings ignored until they become fate. Fate mistaken for cruelty. The cliffs remain. The old ground remains. People still avoid certain paths without being told why. The scream has not been heard publicly in decades, but absence does not imply resolution. Some records do not end. They pause. As the O'Connell echo fades into distance, the next bloodline does not wait for sound or writing. It emerges in halls of marble and gold, where silence is enforced and ambition is mistaken for destiny. There, the bargain wears a crown and hunger learns how to rule. Italy did not need forests or cliffs to conceal its bargains. By the 14th century, power there lived indoors, behind stone walls polished smooth by hands that knew how to take without asking. City-states rose and fell with a speed that trained people to admire ambition as virtue and excuse its cost as necessity. In such a landscape, immortality did not need a promise of eternal life. It only needed a promise that one name would outlast others. The Borgia family understood this instinctively, long before history learned to fear them. The earliest traces of the lineage appear in Valencia, not Rome, in records that predate their infamy by generations. These documents describe men of relentless focus, figures who moved through institutions without settling into them. One ancestor, noted only as a minor cleric, entered a monastery and left days later under quiet compulsion. The surviving marginal note does not accuse him of heresy. It states that he asked questions concerning eternity that were unsuitable for mouths still bound to breath. The phrasing is precise, and it was never corrected. What distinguished the Borgias from other ambitious families was not their appetite for power, but the way that appetite behaved. It did not diminish when fed. It intensified. Each success sharpened the need for the next, as if advancing itself opened a space that could not be closed. This pattern becomes visible long before Rodrigo Borgia ascends to papacy. Letters describe men who slept poorly, who paced at night, who spoke of time as something that pursued them rather than the reverse. Servants noticed candles kept burning in empty rooms. Silence was treated as an enemy. By the time Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI, the Hunger had learned how to wear ceremony. The papal apartments gleamed with wealth, yet witnesses recorded an unease that clung to them like residue. Guards spoke of footsteps in corridors long after doors had been sealed. A secretary described finding the Pope alone in a darkened chamber, whispering words meant for no one present. The sentence he overheard survived because it was written down without interpretation. Nothing is enough. Nothing will ever be enough. The church's response was not exorcism, but containment. Archives were sealed. Incidents were explained as stress, as the weight of office. When lamps extinguished simultaneously in locked rooms, servants were dismissed. When scratches appeared on marble floors where no animal could reach, renovations were ordered. The institution recognized the disturbance but refused to name it, choosing preservation over confrontation. Cesare Borgia inherited the Hunger in its most refined form. Contemporary accounts praise his brilliance, his charisma, his tactical mind. They also note habits that do not align with confidence. He slept with music playing, insisting that quiet pressed too hard against his thoughts. He avoided empty chapels, not out of reverence, but out of discomfort. He confessed to a priest that silence felt like something leaning in to listen. The priest died a week later under circumstances that were recorded and never explained. Lucrezia Borgia's letters offer a different angle on the same phenomenon. History casts her as a symbol of corruption, but her private writings speak instead of exhaustion. She describes mirrors reflecting expressions she was not making, of shadows that lag half a step behind her movement, of a voice that spoke close to her ear without belonging to the room. Sometimes the voice urged more. Sometimes it asked why she hesitated. These entries are consistent across years and locations, which undermines attempts to frame them as momentary distress. The hunger demanded payment, and it accepted it in stages, first through whispers and restlessness, then through isolation, finally through collapse. After Rodrigo's death, the family's power disintegrated with unnatural speed. Allies vanished. Fortresses fell. Wealth evaporated as if recalled. Cesare died during a storm that witnesses insisted had not existed moments earlier. His body was found broken, armor split, face calm in a way that disturbed those who knew him. Lucrezia died young, hollowed by childbirth and fatigue. Her final recorded sentence does not curse or confess. It observes, there is no victory in feeding what does not belong to you. What followed should have ended the story. It did not. Minor branches of the family, stripped of central authority, repeated the same cycle across centuries. Sudden rise, unchecked ambition, rapid decay. Some burned their estates. Some entered monasteries. Some fled into obscurity. None escaped the pattern. A descendant writing in the 18th century summarized it with a clarity that resists metaphor. We rise like flame. We fall like ash. And at the center of the fire, something watches. Historians prefer to frame this as allegory, ambition punished by its own excess. Yet allegory does not extinguish lamps in locked rooms. It does not leave claw-like marks in stone. It does not persist unchanged across generations who never met. The Borgia case demonstrates a different rule than the forest or the valley. Here, the bargain did not arrive as an external force. It unfolded from within, shaping desire until desire became constraint. By the time the name lost its power to terrify, the pattern had already moved on, seeking bloodlines less visible, less protected by marble and title. Eastward, beyond the Italian states, lay a frontier where power was contested by steel rather than ink. There, the bargain would not whisper or hunger quietly. It would spill openly, binding families together through bloodshed. So precise it resembled design. The Carpathian Basin has never pretended to be gentle. In the 15th century, it was a frontier in the truest sense, a place where empires press against one another like grinding plates, where armies pass through often enough that the land learned the sound of marching better than the sound of prayer. Here, blood did not disappear into soil. It soaked, lingered, and resurfaced in memory. When curses formed in this region, they did not attach themselves to forests or names or voices. They attached themselves to balance, to accounts left unsettled. At the center of this final record stand two houses whose fates became inseparable the moment justice was denied. The Hunyadi family rose from military necessity. János Hunyadi was celebrated across Hungary as a defender against the Ottoman advance, a man whose victories slowed an empire. Songs carried his name. Churches rang bells in his honor. But power earned through war breeds suspicion as readily as loyalty. Nobles feared his popularity. Courts feared his momentum. Among those watching closely was the rival house of Szapolyai. For a time, the two families coexisted. Their lands lay within a day's ride. Their children shared tutors. Their alliances overlapped. This proximity matters because it means what followed was not born of ignorance, but of familiarity. When János Hunyadi died in 1456, officially of illness, the ground beneath both houses shifted. His sons inherited not only his legacy, but the unease it had created. 2 months later, Laszlo Hunyadi was arrested and accused of treason. There was no trial that resembled law, no defense that reached beyond formality. He was beheaded within the walls of Buda Castle. Contemporary chronicles record the execution with restraint, but they linger on one detail repeated across sources: the silence afterward. Witnesses describe the courtyard as unnaturally quiet, as if sound itself had been dismissed. On that day, the Danube darkened, not red, not muddy, but dark in a way scribes struggle to describe, likening it to ink spilled into water. Historians later dismissed this as metaphor, yet multiple independent accounts note the same phenomenon within the same narrow window of time. The river returned in normal days later. The record did not. Matthias Hunyadi, younger brother to Laszlo, was taken as a political hostage. He survived. He would later become King Matthias Corvinus, one of Hungary's most formidable rulers. Yet even at the height of his reign, letters from his court describe a man pursued by knights that offered no rest. He avoided the execution courtyard. He woke, shouting his brother's name. Servants reported seeing a shadow in his chambers, standing where no person had entered, head bowed as if waiting. Physicians attributed this to exhaustion. Matthias believed something else. He wrote privately that blood unjustly taken becomes a debt that does not expire. The Szapolyai family prospered in the immediate aftermath. They had supported the execution. They gained favor, land, influence. But prosperity in this record behaves like a trigger rather than a reward. Strange disturbances followed them. Horses refused to cross their gates. Torches extinguished without wind. Portraits cracked down the center, splitting faces with surgical precision. Children woke at night, insisting someone stood in the hall, watching without moving. Rumors spread of Laszlo's ghost, headless and patient. This explanation satisfied the public appetite for narrative, but missed the deeper mechanism at work. The curse binding these families did not behave like revenge. It behaved like accounting. One life taken without balance demanded another, not necessarily from the same body, but from the same line. For generations, the rise of one house mirrored the decline of the other. When Matthias strengthened Hungary, Szapolyai influence faltered. When Matthias died without legitimate heirs, the Hunyadi line thinned to near absence. The balance shifted again. Szapolyai power surged. The pattern is so consistent it reads less like chance and more like geometry. The final convergence came in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs. Hungary fell. The king died. The throne stood empty. Two claimants emerged, János Szapolyai and Ferdinand of Habsburg. The Hunyadi bloodline, once dominant, had no heirs left to speak for it. Yet witnesses at the coronation disputes recorded something that does not belong to political history. A figure seen behind Szapolyai's banner, dressed in outdated armor, cloak torn at the neck. Some said the figure had no face. Others said it had no head. Several recorded the same phrase whispered near the throne: blood must answer blood. Szapolyai claimed the crown. He never slept soundly again. Servants refused to enter his chambers alone. He woke gasping, convinced someone stood behind him. He died suddenly in 1540 after a night of violent dreams. The cause listed was illness. The timing matched the pattern. Within a century, both houses collapsed. War, political pressure, and internal fracture erased them from power. Their estates fell into ruin. Their names lingered only in chronicles and folk memory. Some called it karma. Some called it justice. Central European folklore offers a different frame. When one bloodline destroys another unjustly, their fates knot together. Neither can advance without dragging the other. Neither can escape the reflection. This final case does not end with a single artifact. It ends with absence, empty castles, battlefields where grass grows unevenly, rivers that remember being dark. The residue here is not a stone circle or a page of ink, but a historical imbalance that refused correction until it consumed both sides. Across all 5 bloodlines, the pattern holds. A bargain framed as necessity, a rise that defies ordinary cause, a repetition that outlives individuals, an erasure that leaves evidence rather than closure. These were not curses flung from nowhere. They were transactions entered into without understanding the terms. And if these records endure, if they surface again and again in archives and land in silence, it is because bargains of this kind do not expire. They wait, preserved in ink, in stone, in blood, until someone believes they can ask for more than a life allows.